Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I've seen that many of you have been working on the Reconstruction assessment. I've seen a lot of 6 out of 10s and a lot of 7 out of 10s, which means we're really close to passing that assessment. We just need a little bit more review. So I've created this study guide to help you review the key concepts that you'll see on the assessment. So I have a number of questions down here, and we're going to go through each of them. And you'll want to follow along in Summit and start writing down these answers in this study guide to help you review for the Reconstruction assessment. So if we go over to the Summit tab, you can see that in the Reconstruction, let me pull my screen up, in the Reconstruction focus area, down here there's all of our resources, the PowerPoint, vocabulary, Quizlet, and this Reconstruction Review Study Guide is the document we will be using today to review. Miss Brittingham is also going to be posting a video reviewing the PowerPoint again, so you should have plenty of resources to help you with Reconstruction. Please note that if you have taken Reconstruction 2 or more times, you need to reach out to Mrs. Davis or Mrs. Brittingham, and we will help you through it. We'll kind of guide you to the other pieces that you maybe need to work on. Okay, so let's go through this review. First off, what was Reconstruction? So Reconstruction can be defined in a number of ways. It is the time period after the Civil War. And there were a couple goals of Reconstruction. Goal 1 was to restore the Confederate States back into the United States. And goal 2 was to extend civil rights to newly freed slaves. So those are sort of the 2 key goals of Reconstruction. So Lincoln begins a Reconstruction plan before the war is even over. And Lincoln's goal was to restore the states, the Confederate States, back to the United States as quickly as possible. So to restore the Confederate States back to the U.S. as quickly as possible. I wish I could spell today. So Lincoln's ideas, I guess I'll put here, were to grant amnesty, which we'll say forgiveness or pardon, to former Confederates, restore Confederate property, and to allow states to rejoin the U.S. when 10% of their voters took an oath of loyalty to the U.S. So kind of like a very serious pledge of allegiance, saying that they were going to be loyal. Now Johnson takes over president after Lincoln is assassinated, and Johnson's plan was very similar to Lincoln's. Again, restore the Union as quickly as possible. Forgive former Confederates. Now, not everybody liked this plan. The radical Republicans in Congress are really opposed to both Lincoln and especially Johnson's plans because they felt that forgiving the former Confederates was just way too nice. Okay? So the radical Republicans did not like Johnson's plan because they felt the plan was too lenient or easy on former Confederates. I mean, you can kind of put yourself in their shoes. You know, they just fought a 4-year war against the Confederacy, and now we're just going to let them rejoin like it's no big deal. Very interesting, and you can see why they will not like Lincoln and Johnson's plans. They think it is way too easy for a group of people that were just at war and were so insistent on slavery. So the radical Republicans, part of this plan being too lenient was they felt Johnson's plan allowed for Southerners to continue to oppress African Americans. For example, radical Republicans will blame Johnson for the imposition of black codes in the South. And black codes were laws that restricted African Americans' freedoms. So these slaves that are now free, they're being limited by the black codes. And the radical Republicans look to President Johnson and say, hey, that's your fault because your Reconstruction plan was way too lenient. It was not tough enough. So radical Republicans blame Johnson for black codes, as an example. Johnson had a major radical Republican opponent in Congress. His name was Charles Sumner. Okay, so Charles Sumner was really the leading voice of the radical Republicans, and he's very critical of Johnson. So Charles Sumner criticizes President Johnson's plan for Reconstruction and how Reconstruction goes. He says Reconstruction is a failure because of Johnson. So ultimately, Johnson will be impeached. Johnson is impeached by the House of Representatives. He is the first president to ever be impeached, but stays in office as president because the Senate did not vote to remove him. So once you get impeached, you have to go on trial in the Senate. Johnson was saved by one vote. So he was able to stay president by one vote. So if we go back up to our very first question, what was Reconstruction? One of those main goals was to extend civil rights to newly freed slaves. That brings us down to the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was part of Reconstruction. You have to remember, Reconstruction is a government system. It's a government program, I guess you could say. It is the U.S. government sending in the military and sending officials down into the southern states to rebuild, to get those states back into the country, and also to protect and extend the rights of newly freed slaves. So it's part of Reconstruction. The goal, to assist newly freed slaves. So some of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau would do was help freed African Americans negotiate jobs. And we'll talk about sharecropping. Put that there. Or build schools. So you have to remember, the slaves are freed, and that's really wonderful, but the slaves really have nothing. They have no money. They have no education. They need to find jobs and ways to support themselves. And that is the goal of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, black codes in Jim Crow laws are a little different. The Freedmen's Bureau extends rights to slaves. I'm going to put that up here. Extend civil rights. Black codes in Jim Crow laws are kind of the opposite. They are both meant to restrict the rights and freedoms of newly freed slaves. So black codes in Jim Crow laws sort of contradict the Freedmen's Bureau. And that was why the Freedmen's Bureau was so necessary, because white Southerners were coming up with laws that were very restrictive to these newly freed slaves. So black codes, they were put into practice right after the Civil War to limit newly freed slaves. Now, Jim Crow laws are much bigger and much more extensive. So Jim Crow laws put into practice after Reconstruction ends and lasted for almost 100 years. Jim Crow laws were made on the state level. And the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, supported Jim Crow laws because it said states could separate facilities by race. So you would have, example, whitewater fountain versus a black water fountain. We're pretty familiar with that kind of segregation during the civil rights movement. And like I said, this would last for about 100 years. Jim Crow laws, again, they're meant to restrict the rights of African Americans and meant to keep white Southerners in positions of power or superior social standing. So really kind of making African Americans second-class citizens. All right, so we just have a few more here. What were the goals of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? Generally, to extend the rights, to extend civil rights to newly freed slaves protected in the Constitution. Now, we'll see that these amendments can be interpreted in ways that are not very equal. So you need to know all three of them. The 13th Amendment officially freed slaves. The 14th Amendment gave anyone born in the U.S. citizenship, and thus the Bill of Rights applied to them. So this one is the most broad. The 14th is the most broad. It's just your general rights, your right to vote, your freedom of speech, your right to bear arms, your right to a fair trial. All of those things kind of fall under the 14th Amendment. And we will see that that is oftentimes limited by different groups in the South. And then the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Okay, so you need to know all three of those amendments. Now, what's going to happen is Reconstruction is considered a failure because we start to see hate groups pop up in the South. So not only are there laws like black codes and Jim Crow laws that restrict African Americans, we'll actually see groups like the Ku Klux Klan really emerge and begin coming up with a lot of violence, and their whole goal is to oppress African Americans. So they will terrorize them, intimidate, mob violence, and then even murder. So the whole idea is to keep whites on top of society and keep African Americans as second-class citizens. So even though they have rights and even though they're not slaves, the KKK wants to go back to that time when whites had all of the power. So who was in the KKK? Former Confederates. And it was whites of all social classes, so rich and poor. So it is very much a racial thing, not a class thing. Now, one thing that I do find that people have been missing a lot is sharecropping. So sharecropping is a system where former slaves work on farms, often their old plantation, and they make very little money, and have to share their crops with the landowners. So the slaves do not own land, they're making very little money, and they have to share their crops. So it's a really hard system. And then super quickly here, because I only have 10 seconds on this video, literacy tests and poll taxes. those were both means of restricting the African Americans'